Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar, The Road Ahead for Social Justice, Uplifting Border Voices. I'm Bridget Whalen. I'm the Training and Engagement Coordinator here at the Opportunity Agenda, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. The Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds toward lasting policy and culture change. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 3 about the road ahead for social justice. Today, we're very glad to be joined by 2 of our partners and former Communications Institute Fellows, Estrid Dominguez and Vicki, as well as our own Julie Fisher-Rao, to talk about how the social justice community can stand with immigrants and communities living along the U.S.-Mexico border. We'll be taking questions after each section of the presentation, so please feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel. You can also tweet questions to me at Bridget M. Whalen on Twitter. We're going to attempt to answer as many of your questions as we can, so please keep those questions coming throughout the conversation. You can also feel free to join the conversation online by using the hashtag #LoveYourBorder or by tweeting at OpAgenda. After the webinar concludes today, a short evaluation is going to pop up on your screen. Please do take the time to fill that out so that we can improve our future webinars based on your feedback. You're also going to receive a follow-up email with a few different materials from today's webinar, including a recording of the presentation, and you should feel free to share that with anyone in your networks who couldn't join us today. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. A big thank you again for joining us, and a special thank you to each of our speakers. First up is Julie Fisher-Rao, Senior Framing and Messaging Coordinator with the Opportunity Agenda.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining today. So today we're going to talk about how to talk about the border region and how to move conversations away from the dominant conversation that's happening, which is obviously about building a huge wall. And I want to talk a lot about how to balance these short-term and long-term conversations. We know that the short-term conversation is important, how to guard against and protect against these harmful narratives about securing the border and keeping people out and all of that, while also really putting forth a long-term conversation that is more about what we really need to have in the border region in order for people to feel safe, be safe, and protect everyone's rights. Next slide, please. So with that, I've got 5 quick tips. So the first thing is to really think about how to humanize the discussion. So we hear so much about a wall, a border, as though it's a line literally in the sand. And we know it's not. This is a whole region. There are communities along this region that are, really deeply affected by the policies that are happening there and will be deeply affected by the construction of a wall if that should happen. And so ways to humanize the discussion are, first of all, to move away from just talking about the border, but to talk about border communities, border regions, border lands, and also to talk about the people who live there, to talk about the culture that's there, the history that's there, and the traditions that are already there. One way to talk about culture is to talk very specifically about, the food traditions, to talk about sports teams even, to talk about, cultural traditions that have been happening over time, the shared history of people on both sides of the, within both countries. That this is an area that's long shared all of this, and just a line running through it does not stop that or change it. Next slide, please. So the next point that's very important is to talk about how people living in this region need to have a voice in decisions that very directly affect them. This doesn't happen all the time. So people who are living there have a lot to say about not wanting to live with drones flying overhead or having to go through checkpoints on their way to school or on their way to work. And a lot of people don't know what day-to-day life is like in the border region. And so giving a chance for those voices to come forward, but also saying over and over again that, look, we can talk all we want about what we as a nation think we want in this region, but the people who are actually there, we need to listen to them first and foremost as well. Next slide, please. And then there's also a really good point to be made about the current border policies and the proposed border policies. The spending that all of this entails is a violation of our values. And this is different from a scarcity argument that's talks about how we don't have enough money to do this. The money would be better spent doing other things. But we don't want to say, act as though there's not enough money to go around, because those arguments tend to hurt progressive narratives in general. But what we can say is that the spending is a violation of our values. It's not, having checkpoints, have the violation of human rights that happen with this huge police force that is in the border region that is violating people's rights, violating due process, not transparent, the use of drones that can, spy on everybody. All of these are not in line with our values. And so we want to make sure that any policies and the spending that goes along with them are in line with our values. And then we know that there's a lot of misinformation happening around the border region right now. Obviously, we hear this all the time, and these are just 5 examples of myths that I found online that people are talking about. The problem with listing them, as I have here, is that listing them as just to debunk them further ingrains them in people's heads. So instead of saying myth, the U.S.-Mexico border is violent, talk about how safe it is instead. Instead of talking about how the border is a terrorist hub, again, talk about these are really safe communities. A lot of time, energy, money has gone into making sure that we do know who's coming across the border. There's a lot of, statistics and facts that will tell us that immigration is at a net 0. There's not more people coming over. But to try not to restate the myths as though they are facts, to try not to restate the opposition argument, but rather give more airtime to our own narratives and stories about the safety that's happening. These communities are safe, they're economic hubs, people are living here that need a say in what's happening, and that we need to make sure that our spending and that our policies are in line with our values. Tell that story instead of spending too much time just countering the opposition story. Next. And finally, we see a lot of folks, when talking about immigration in a larger context, really use the idea of securing the border as a way to try to get more, like, say, bipartisan support for immigration issues. And we know that this doesn't really work by just continuing to pour resources and energy into militarizing the border. We haven't seen any movement on the other policies that we want. So what we end up with is just throwing the folks who are living in the region under the bus for not any forward movement. And so we really need to and we also see that the story of always saying over and over again, well, first we have to secure the border, has led to a lot of folks, believing that needs to happen. So people are buying into this argument that the border needs more securing, when we know it doesn't. So we need to just be careful to be telling a really helpful and supportive story. As you'll hear from our next speakers, folks who are living in the region are facing a lot of challenges as it is. So we as allies who live in the interior or who live further away from the U.S.-Mexico border can do a lot more in our communications to really support their efforts in talking about the border as a region, as people who live there needing to have a voice and needing to align our spending with our values, and in not throwing them under the bus by insisting that we need a more secure border when we know that is not the issue. What we need is better, more sensible policies that really help folks in the region. So then finally, we always suggest that when you're building a message, you can keep 4 main points in mind. The first is talk about values. What kind of values do we want to be talking about when we're talking about the border? We want to be talking about community, we want to be talking about safety, we want to be talking about opportunity. Everybody wants those things. We all want to live in communities that are safe. What is real safety? Well, it's making sure you can trust the law enforcement that's in your area, making sure that that the spending is in line with our values, that due process is being protected, that human rights are being protected. The problem, it's important to frame the problem as a threat to values. So the problem is that the current policies are threatening human rights. They're not actually making us safer. And then make sure that you always follow up with the solution, that there's a solution in the argument, that we're not just complaining about things. We actually have a road forward. And finally, an action. What can your audience, the audience that you're speaking to in the moment, actually do to move all of this forward? So this is just some sample language around the border region to kind of give you an example of how this can look in talking about the values, and again, about safety and community rights, how the policies violate those values, and then suggestions of what we need to do instead. And then finally, what the audience can do in the moment. And that's my piece of it. And so I'm very happy to hand it back off to Bridget and answer any questions that you have at this time.
Great. Thanks, Julie, so much. If you have any questions for Julie, go ahead and enter them into the questions function of your GoToWebinar panel, and we will make sure that she gets to answer as many of those as possible. We did have a question about, you mentioned talking about the border without talking about a wall, but that kind of seems an impossible and daunting task when there's so much in the news about the wall. Our president is talking about a wall. How can advocates stay relevant to that conversation without talking about a wall or focusing on the wall?
Sure, and that is a bit misleading. The name of, I'm not suggesting that we can't ever talk about the wall. Obviously, we need to say that that's, a wall is irresponsible. A wall is not what we need right now. What we need is, I'm suggesting we pivot very quickly to that part of what we actually need, what the policies that will be helpful, the policies that will actually move us forward. We just need to make sure we make that pivot very quickly, because if we spend all of our time arguing about why the wall is a bad idea, we're just giving the wall more airtime.
Great. Another question from one of our participants: how can we leverage this intense moment without myth-busting when it seems so important to counter the blatant and harmful untruths that are out there?
Yeah, and I think the counter is the right idea there. So the untruths do need to be addressed. It's in the restating them consistently or spending too much time on them without moving to the real story. And I think keeping the eyes on the prize of what the real story is just so important here, because the real story counters those myths. The real story of what we need, what the border region needs, what policies actually need to be in place to keep communities safe. That's the story that we want to recenter people on. Because the more they hear that, then the more inoculated they are to the harmful myths. Right now, people who live in areas away from the border only have the news coverage really to depend on. And the news coverage, the main narrative will tell you that the border is a dangerous place, that it's a big fence with barbed wire on top of it, that there's terrorism and drug smuggling and all of these things happening. The more you just say that's not true, is not going to change people's minds. But the more you give a picture of what's really going on, then they have a better place to go when they hear stories about border region. They can picture people on their way to school getting stopped at a checkpoint, or communities, facing human rights abuses because there's not enough oversight with the law enforcement that's in the area. So give people an alternative, the real story, and focus on that. That is countering the untruths that we're hearing.
One, more broadly than just messaging around the border, but one messaging point that's being used increasingly in the immigration debate by advocates is this idea of no human being being illegal. No human being is illegal. It sounds a little bit like myth-busting, and I'm wondering, Julie, what your reaction is to that messaging.
Yeah, I see the temptation to use that language. I do believe that should go without saying. And when we say it, then we're giving it credence, right? We are repeating that other people think that. We need to move forward by just already assuming that that is true and not using the language of the other side. So the more we use the quote-unquote illegal word, the more we deepen its power within our audience's minds. And so I think it's important to move forward and say what all people are. All people are deserving of rights. All people are deserving of dignity and respect. Our laws and our policies and our attitudes need to reflect that. And if they don't, we have to question what kind of country we are, what kind of country we want to be, where we need to improve, what kind of people we are, all of these things. So put it back on us and our own attitudes, not the whole, not repeat the other side's view of what people are or aren't.
Great. Thanks, Julie, very much. We're joined now by two of our partners in the border region who live and work there. They're also former Communications Institute fellows, and we're very glad that they're with us today. The first is Astrid Dominguez. She's the Immigrant Rights Policy Strategist with the ACLU of Texas. And we're also joined by Vicki Galbeca, who's Director of the Regional Center for Border Rights, housed at the ACLU of New Mexico. Vicki and Astrid, thanks for being here, and I'll kick it off to you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank everyone for joining this presentation. Astrid and I are sort of going to tag team this, and so we'll just kind of bounce back and forth. But again, I'm Vicki Galbeca, and I have lived in the border region for most of my life. I came to the United States from Mexico City in my early 20s, went to college in Pennsylvania, and lived in Washington, D.C. before coming to the U.S.-Mexico border region, where I've lived for more than a couple decades. I have family on both sides of the border and have also lived on both sides. I now direct the Regional Center for Border Rights for the ACLU of New Mexico, where our vision is to stand with border communities to protect and defend U.S. constitutional rights so that all families may live freely, safely, and with dignity.
Thank you, Vicki. And I'm Astrid Dominguez. I have been a border resident for almost my entire life. I was born in Brownsville, Texas, and I have lived on both sides of the borders, the U.S. and in Mexico. This is where I grew up. The border is the place I call home. And I'm the policy strategist for immigrant rights at the ACLU of Texas, where I have focused most of my work on border issues, particularly abuses of authority and fighting to uphold everyone's rights in that region.
So this is Vicki again. If you have never visited the border region, you should know that the border region consists of vibrant, diverse communities like Brownsville, Tucson, and San Diego. It is also home to a colorful landscape of varied flora and cactus, like, my personal favorite, the majestic saguaro and the Oregon pipe cactus of the Sonora Desert, and the yucca bacata and the ocotillo of the Chihuahuan Desert. The border is embraced also by the Gulf of Mexico and fertile lands from the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas, and by open waters of the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego, San Isidro. The city of El Paso, which I consider the belly button of the border, is among the safest cities in the nation. And just in the border region, there are roughly about 12 to 15 million people living here, and in an area that is rich with national monuments, commerce, culture, and several languages. Our communities are filled with hardworking people, Latinx families who have lived in the region for generations, members of the First Nations, and newcomers and visitors from both the north and south. And the 10 states along the border represent the 4th largest economy in the world. More than 1 million people cross legally to shop, be tourists, attend our universities, or visit their families. Our binational communities depend on each other in terms of jobs, shopping, and safety. I believe most people in the U.S. don't know that 1 in 24 jobs in the U.S. relies on the trade we have with Mexico, our third largest trade partner, or that net migration from Mexico is at 0, meaning that in recent years, more people have returned to Mexico than have come to the United States. And that's where the problem lies. What people think the border is and the reality of the border are often two different things. I personally have witnessed the transformation of the border region from a fluid, fairly harmonious, multi-state, binational community to one that has become overly militarized and divided under the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. And today, border communities are now bracing to see how much worse this militarization will become under the new administration. Next slide, please. At the southwest border alone, we have thousands of federal immigration enforcement agents who are not only at our ports of entry, but who conduct daily roving patrols and stops, including at fixed checkpoints in our communities. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the GIF is working here on this particular slide, but you should see it getting darker and darker, and it represents the number of Border Patrol agents that we have seen growing along the border. So Astrid, go ahead.
Thanks, Vicki. So let's talk about the wall. We have 650 miles of physical barriers. In some places, fences almost 20 feet high and 2 to 3 layers deep. The places where a physical barrier doesn't currently exist are places that have a harsh topography like sand dunes, canyons, or mountainous terrains and rivers, and where any barrier would simply be logical. Trump's fantasy of filling the border with a wall is based fundamentally on racial and ethnic bias. So the border wall is a political theater at the expense of our civil liberties, but it's not rational national security policy. In places like Brownsville, parts of the wall divide neighborhoods, meaning like you're dividing U.S. territory. And the reason for that is because we cannot build a wall right at the levee because of international treaties. So think about this. Every mile of the fence, the cost of the fence is between $7 to $12 million in areas that are the poorest in the U.S. And think about what we can do with that money. We also have surveillance technologies galore. They include not only automatic license plate readers and cameras, but also drones and aerostats surveilling our skies. And just an anecdote, a couple of years ago, one of those aerostats fell in the Rio Grande Valley. Nobody was hurt, but there's questions about what they're doing there and effectiveness. The dramatic increase of U.S. Customs and Border Protection personnel and equipment has not been accompanied by commensurate accountability, oversight, and transparency. This has led to increases in abuses and impunity, along with a mistrust between our border communities and CBP, the largest law enforcement agency in the nation.
So we also have intrusive Border Patrol checkpoints that are actually far from the actual border line that stop borderlanders as they go about their daily lives, going to school, work, or a doctor's appointment. The government's own data shows that less than 1% of all Border Patrol apprehensions happen at these checkpoints, and that the vast majority of prosecutions that result from checkpoints are of U.S. citizens for small quantities of drugs, including marijuana, even though, and I think this is an important point, these checkpoints are not supposed to be general crime control operations. Their stated purpose is constitutionally limited to brief immigration inquiries.
So another factor that contributes to the extraordinary authority that these agents display in our communities are outdated rules created without significant public debate in the 1950s. The Department of Homeland Security interprets a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act to allow Border Patrol to operate interior checkpoints and engage in other enforcement up to 100 air miles from land and maritime borders. But if you drew a picture of what this would mean, a full 2/3 of the U.S. population would be subjected to Border Patrol roving patrols and checkpoints. So this includes all of New York, Maine, Florida, and cities like San Francisco and Washington, D.C. Virtually everyone that I know has been subjected to questioning at both fixed and roving checkpoints.
Borderlanders also experience racial profiling by border enforcement operations. And we did this report about New Mexico that showed that more than 90% of people who had experienced abusive treatment at checkpoints were U.S. citizens, 80% of whom self-identified as Latinx or Hispanic. Unfortunately, the government's posture is that the same racial profiling guidelines that apply to other federal agents like the FBI do not apply to much of CBP's border operations. Again, the largest law enforcement agency in the nation. Probably we cannot have this conversation about the border without mentioning the 55 deaths since January 2010 that have resulted during an encounter with a CBP official. 6 of these cases were of people standing in Mexico when an agent on the U.S. side opened fire and killed them, 3 of whom were teenagers. In only one of these cases, the case of Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, an agent is currently facing federal charges of homicide. Next week, the Supreme Court will hear a case about whether the government can face civil liability for cross-border shootings. This graph shows the same numbers as the previous slide, but broken down by year. These use of force numbers do not include the deaths of migrants who die when only trying to get here. U.S. enforcement policies, unfortunately, such as border fencing and the more than doubling of border enforcement agents who are mostly deployed in urban areas, have forced migrants to cross in more rural and perilous regions, resulting in thousands dying in Arizona and New Mexico deserts and near the Falfurrias checkpoint in Texas. Many of our border families are still dealing with the hurt and trauma of losing their loved ones, despite the fact that even internal reviews have found that many of these uses of force to be suspect. So while immigration reform's efforts stalled in 2013, under the Obama administration, border advocates forced proactive administrative reforms to increase accountability and oversight over CBP's police practices. As a result, CBP issued new use of force handbook and training and new national standards that establish minimum agency-wide policies on detention conditions. And in 2016, CBP implemented new measures of transparency by publicly releasing the results of the National Use of Force Review Board, reporting aggregate statistics on uses of force, and issuing its first annual report on disciplinary actions taken against CBP agents and officers. But we know that under the new administration, we definitely have our work cut out for us. We expect to see Border Patrol community raids, particularly in rural areas, and families torn away from their loved ones and people deported in hours, if not minutes. We also expect to fight back against more collaborations of state and local police with federal immigration officials. Our hope is that local police will continue to value community policing and understand that if victims and witnesses of a crime are afraid to call police, public safety for all is undermined. We are also concerned about the expansion of detention and further criminalization of people who are only wanting what we all want, the ability to feed their families or be with their U.S. citizen children and spouses.
Border organizations have long pushed to bring more accountability to border communities and justice for those who have died at the hands of CBP. This through the implementation of policing best practices and robust oversight measures. Nevertheless, CBP continues to undermine recommendations such as the ones made in President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing report. The biggest law enforcement agency considers itself exceptional, apart from all the other law enforcement agencies in the country, and entitled to put at risk the well-being and safety of our communities. Just to give you a few examples of those recommendations we've made in the past, and body-worn cameras, more internal affairs staff, public reporting, issue clear prohibition of use of race, so pretty much no profiling, and better training. Now, Trump's executive orders. Trump has issued an executive order to take all appropriate steps to immediately plan, design, and construct a physical wall along the southern border of the United States. The federal government will also allocate all legally available resources to the construction and operation of additional detention or control facilities near the land border with Mexico. And they also want to hire 5,000 more Border Patrol agents in order to address supposed asylum fraud. The order instructs the Secretary of DHS to also take all appropriate action to expedite the removal of removable aliens. This likely translates to a hardening of the asylum process for anyone who attempts to seek it traveling from Mexico. Other provisions also include unspecified collaboration with states and local authorities, like Vicki just mentioned, and increased access to federal lands. An important distinction to keep in mind is that some of these announcements require congressional action to authorize or appropriate or both. We all saw what happened at the airport a couple of weeks ago with the Muslim ban. People were surprised at CBP's actions at the airport, the lack of transparency and access, the abuse of authority. Well, that's what border residents have faced for the past 15 years, an unsupervised agency that believes it's above the law. What you saw at the airport is the CBP organizational culture that border residents experience every single day. So when you think about the Muslim ban, keep the border region in mind too, so we can fight this together.
These executive orders have created a great deal of panic and fear in our border families. Expanding the already massive size and power of security forces in the border region will further erode the freedoms and rights of tens of millions of people who call our northern and southern border communities home. It seems ironic that in some of the safest cities in our nation, terror is not coming from outside our borders, but from within. That is, from our own government's agents. Across the nation, people who believe in core American values of justice, equality, and freedom are feeling targeted and attacked by a presidency that lives in an alternate reality and promotes only fear and divisiveness. In the border, we really just truly believe that we deserve a 21st century border, one that honors the vital economic and cultural contributions of border communities to the nation. That means instituting common sense border policies that uphold the dignity of border residents and instill transparency, accountability, and oversight as fundamental cornerstones of humane border security. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. We very much appreciate your interest, and we're looking forward to your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicki and Astrid. That was great, a lot of great information. If you have questions for Vicki and Astrid, feel free to put them into the question panel on your the question section on your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll get those questions posed to our guest speakers, and hopefully we can answer as many of those questions as possible. We do have one question around, some of the challenges about changing this narrative about the border. As I think you mentioned, and I think Julie mentioned as well, most people have not been to the border region. They don't know much about it except what they hear on the news, which is not necessarily a helpful narrative. So what are some of the challenges around changing that narrative, and how are y'all thinking about your communications in light of the reality of that narrative?
Thank you, Bridget. This is Astrid. I think that every time we hear negative coverage of the border, and it's hard not to do the myth buster, right? It's like, this is not right, or this is accurate. But I think that painting it, the challenge is making the community's voice heard, right? Like making sure that it's border residents who are sharing their stories, that are sharing the narrative. We often hear, policymakers and other people address these issues and these concerns, but people, like you said, they've never been to the border. So it's important that people from the border, the communities, leaders, even lawmakers, that are those spokespeople for our region. That's, I've found that a very helpful way to change that, share those narratives, positive narratives as well. Even though we have lots of negatives, to share those positive narratives with reporters, with policymakers, and the community in general whenever we go to other parts. And social media is great for that. But giving that voice, letting them speak for themselves and say, this is where we live, this is our reality, and this is who we are. I think that's the most effective way that we found to change that.
And just to add to what Astrid said, I just was having this thought about, I don't know if people on the phone are familiar with the green chilies of New Mexico. They pretty much come from this town called Hatch. And I remember in 2013 when the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill was passed through the Senate, and on it they tacked on a $46 billion amendment that was sending 20,000 more troops to the border, Border Patrol agents to the border. I remember going up to Hatch and noticing that downtown Hatch, most of the businesses are all bordered up. And that's only changed since we started to aggressively militarize the border. Because a lot of people used to come to Hatch to do their shopping there and patronize the restaurants. And now we're just, and so I think that what would be helpful too is for people to understand how these border enforcement policies are affecting our communities, and to really step back and take a more holistic view of the effect of these policies and how they're affecting border communities.
Great, thank you both. One question is about, well, first of all, we had a question about this presentation being available after the webinar, and it will be available. We will send you, anyone who registered for the webinar will get a recording and all the slides, and you should feel free to forward those to your networks or colleagues who weren't able to join us today. So I just wanted to reassure all the participants of that. But moving back to questions for Astrid and Vicki, there's been a question around audiences and persuadable, like the persuadable public. How do you appeal to persuadable people who may care about border issues, but also really want to see more border security, or want to see us, secure the border, which is one of these national talking points? How do you appeal to people? How would you message around getting them to understand that that's not the answer?
I think that the answer is fundamentally what you've already mentioned, right? Not really talk about myth busting, but basically share what the reality of the border is. You know, our cities are among the safest in the nation. We make valuable contributions to the economy and culture of this nation. And that we all, you know, people move. That's part of our natural history for human beings, is to move. I moved here from Tucson, Arizona for my job opportunity, and it's just a natural thing. And so we just need to sort of put a human face on who we are, I believe, fundamentally.
I wanted to add something there too. You know, I think Julie talked about it, the shared values. You know, those people that understand and care about the border, but you know, finding that common ground. What are our shared values, and making them understand, you know, the policies that are impacting, who's being impacted, but also this isn't just about a border issue. This is, you know, an issue of immigrants. What happens at the border affects everybody, and that's often something that gets ignored. So when they see that, I think, you know, I often find people like, you know, they do change the vision of the border. Like, this isn't about immigration. This isn't just about immigrants. This affects everybody who lives there.
Great, thank you. You mentioned having family on both sides of the border, and we have a question about how family members in Mexico or communities in Mexico are reacting to this increased conversation around the border and militarization at the border. You know, we talk a lot about how this affects communities on the U.S. side, but what about communities on the Mexico side?
This is Esther. I can speak to that. Most of my family, well, a big part of my family lives in Mexico, and I think that, you know, this new sentiment isn't new to them. Even though it's new for the entire country, for the border, we had been there already. We're talking about an agency that lacks oversight and accountability, and they have struggled with that for the past 15 years. You know, people, it doesn't matter which side of the border you are, whenever you interact with any of these agents, you know, they you know, often are abused, harassed, questioned. So this isn't new for them, and you know, that's sad. But you know, I think we hear a lot more from the U.S. side. What's going to happen to us that are in the U.S. And I think that's something new. That even though we were already struggling with, I think now not just immigrants are scared, but the community in general, and that is new.
Yeah, and this is Vicki, and I just wanted to add that, you know, I have a brother that lives in Tijuana and Ensenada, with his wife. I lived in Monterrey, Mexico, and I have several friends who live in Ciudad Juarez, and I think that there is a palpable sense of not understanding if this is really if we're actually taking a common sense approach to border security, because I think we definitely can look at what makes more sense in terms of efficient border security that is also one that is more cost effective, along with looking at the real needs of the border communities and it doesn't seem like there's a rational national policy on border security. And I think that there are better ways to do it that don't seem to be considered right now. And so how do we open up and shift the conversation in that direction, as opposed to focusing on policies that just are not working and they're not addressing the problem. I have actually said a border wall is a 15th century solution to a non-existent problem, and we really do need to move the conversation forward and really look at a 21st century policy.
Great, thanks. We had another great question from one of our participants. Immigration is often intrinsically linked to border issues. However, the border is more than just immigration. How do you tease out the immigration question and shift people's attention to the broader set of issues that concern border communities, Also, is binational a good frame for that conversation?
Answering the...
Go ahead, Vicki.
No, I would say that even though it's binational because they're technically speaking to countries side by side, but it's probably more multicultural because there's certainly First Nations along the border, like the Tohono O'odham Nation. So I wouldn't. That's sort of a common term to use right now, but I wouldn't use it completely as a finite way of describing the border. And I forgot the first part of the question. Sorry.
That's okay. The first part of the question is about immigration being intrinsically linked to border issues. However, the border issues are broader than just immigration. So how do you tease out that immigration question and shift people's attention to the broader set of issues that concern border communities?
So diversity, I often, when I talk about this, it's a question I get very often, and it's two different issues. And people often try, and well, policy makers try to talk about it. They want one before they can get to the other one. So they want border security before, they get to immigration reform. And they are two different things. We all want, a secure border in terms that, we don't want narcotics coming across and so forth. But when there isn't comprehensive immigration reform, so there is no way for people to come here, whether they want to come work, whether they want to come and reunite with their families, or whether they're seeking, they're here to seek asylum, so they get here, and that's the law, and they can do that. Until we fix that, people are going to continue to cross the way they do, and those people don't represent any threats to national security. If we really want to address national security issues, we first need to fix our immigration system, which is broken, and then, focus on, the border security component, which, DHS Secretary says that the border has never been more secure than ever. We have almost 18,000 Border Patrol agents in the southern border. So, they need to focus their resources in, narcotics and other things, but let's fix their immigration system now, and then they can focus on the real threats.
Great, thanks, Astrid. I think, Astrid, you mentioned earlier, it may have been Vicki, about some of these border communities being some of the poorest in the nation. So that's another issue that's affecting border communities. So how do you separate that from the immigration question, or do you separate that? Is there a way that those two things are interlinked?
Vicki, do you want to respond?
This is Vicki. I don't remember saying that they're among the poorest in the nation. I said they're the safest in the nation. But I think that, just like any part of the country, we do have areas that could benefit from money, and these are, areas that could benefit. So one thing that we have been thinking about, like particularly around the last immigration reform bill, was that they were going to spend $46 billion on more securing the border, and there were a lot of people in the community who felt, what we really need are, and it varied in each region of the border, what we really need is better schools, and we need better healthcare services and better mental health services. And what I would do with that amount of money? There was one town south of Las Cruces that experienced some flooding, and boy, they could have used that money to shore up the dam that's there. And so the question there is, is there a more efficient use of that money for our communities in a way that's more productive?
And this is Astrid. You're right, Bridget. I did mention that during my remarks. Cameron and Hidalgo counties in the Rio Grande Valley, they're among the poorest counties in the U.S. And those two counties combined have almost 60 miles of fencing. So there's a border wall already there. And in some parts, like, the border wall doesn't make any sense because it's dividing neighborhoods. So, like, people have to cross the border wall to go to their home or to go to work every single day. And, you know, whenever we take people to the border, people like get, you know, they just get amazed. It's like, wait, where are we? In the U.S., Mexico? And they're like, no, you're still in the U.S. Just this fence doesn't make any sense. It's in the middle of, you know, nowhere. I mean, it divides, not nowhere, but it divides the neighborhood. But then keep in mind that 1 mile of that fence would cost average is between $7 to $12 million. And you are in one of the poorest counties in the U.S. So to what Vicki said, how can we use that? I mean, I'm sure we can use that in schools, education, healthcare, services. So, you know, that often gets lost in conversation. And until you go to the border and you see the reality, you know, people can have a better understanding. Or when you hear from these border residents, what it what it feels like to go through a border wall every day, to go to work, to go to school, and you know how they feel like, hey, you know, I'm kind of in the south of the fence, so am I like a kind of second-class citizen because I'm south of the fence? Am I more, you know, could I get stopped by Border Patrol there because I'm there? But they live there, and they see it, you know, the wasteful, you know, the amount of money they're spending in something that is really not accomplishing anything.
Great. Thank you both very much. I think that's the extent of our questions for today. I want to thank Astrid, Vicki, and Julie so much for sharing their knowledge with us today. And a big thank you also to the Opportunity Agenda staff who made today's webinar a success, especially Elizabeth Johnson and Jamila Brown. If you have any questions about today's material, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can direct any of those questions to our speakers. And again, we'll be sending a link with a recording of the webinar and the slides as a follow-up email. So if you registered, you will be getting that information, and you should feel free to share that with any of your colleagues. And another reminder, as you close out of GoToWebinar, a short evaluation is going to pop up. So please do fill that out. We do take your feedback into consideration as we plan future webinars. So thank you again so much for joining us today, and everyone have a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks.